Public utility companies have failed. They failed in Japan, where inefficient management caused a railway accident that killed hundreds. They failed in India, where a lack of incentive means that 43% of the population still goes without clean water. Today, Team Singapore believes that the solution to all of these failures will be to privatize public utility companies, because doing so best serves the government and, more importantly so, best serves the people. So before I move on to my case, allow me first to define a few key terms in today's motion. What exactly do we mean when we discuss public utility companies? These are government-owned corporations involved in the provision of basic goods and services which the population requires. At the moment, these public utility companies enjoy a government-mandated monopoly and are under direct government oversight and are staffed by governmental bureaucrats. Therefore, their entire operation, such as the decision of prices, quality, and accessibility, are determined by bureaucracy. Some examples of public utilities include water, no thank you sir, power, transport, and sanitation. So what exactly is privatize? It is the act of transferring ownership of these public utility companies from the government to private entities, and these can include individuals or corporations. So how exactly are we going to do this on the side of Team Singapore? No thank you, madam. And this leads me on very nicely to our policy, our vision of how this will be implemented in reality. Essentially, our policy has a few broad aims, four broad aims rather. Our aims, basically, is to provide public utilities which are firstly, more efficient, secondly, thank you sir, have better accessibility, thirdly, have better quality, and lastly, better for the government and the people. Allow me first to illustrate the two different types of public utility companies that exist. The first type, essentially, is the huge type of corporation and company that provides all different types of public utilities to different parts of the country, including some examples being Malaysia and Singapore, where we have one public utilities board providing public utilities to everyone, ladies and gentlemen. The second type of public utility companies, essentially, is a system where they are separate companies providing different public utilities to the different parts of the country. So how exactly are we going to privatize this? We're going to privatize this over a period of time where specific parts of these companies dealing with the provision of specific and different types of public utilities will be sold off to different companies, to different private entities. So for example, Singapore's Public Utilities Board will be broken down into different portions like garbage disposal, power, water, transportation, and they'll be sold off, thank you sir, to different parts and different private corporations. Therefore, what will happen at the end of the day is that we will now have multiple providers of the same public utility. So, for example, instead of just having Bell provide telecommunications in the USA before privatization, we'll now have Bell, AT&T, Singular, Verizon, etc. Allow me then to clarify four things. That first, existing antitrust laws will ensure that there will be no monopoly of a single company of all public utilities. Secondly, the proposition will institute targeted subsidies to the poor to ensure that they can still afford these public utilities. No, thank you, sir. Thirdly, today's debate exists only in countries with free functioning economies. And lastly, we say that these private companies will still have to be subjected to governmental reviews. For example, checks on corruption through audits, like any other private company, and also the enforcing of existing public health and safety guidelines. And yeah. Today, Team Singapore believes that the privatization, no thank you madam, better serves the people and the government. And I will show you this in my first speech by showing you how privatization brings about undeniable benefits. While my second speaker, Dana, will show you how governmental costs and political wrangling compels us to privatize public utility companies. So moving on to my first point, my first and only point, about how competition brings about benefits. Now, essentially, we say that private companies have fundamentally different incentive structures from governmental or public companies. First, ladies and gentlemen, we say that these private companies face very stiff competition, hold on a moment, sir, face very stiff competition from competing providers. And secondly, that these private companies are driven by profit motive, because unlike governmental companies, there will be no governmental bailout if they were to make losses or run into the red. And before I go to show you how these different incentive structures lead to the benefits, yes, sir.
Given that services like electricity and water have one national grid, how can you ensure that there won't be a monopoly?
No, sir. We say, in fact, in many countries, especially big countries, there are separate grids for different parts of the country, ladies and gentlemen. For example, in the USA, you have the North grid, South grid, East grid, West grid, Middle grid, and we say that all these different grids will be sold off to different companies, ladies and gentlemen, therefore ensuring that these incentive structures I'm talking about will ensure that we provide it more efficiently, provide it with better quality, and provide it with better accessibility, thank you, sir, to the people of the country, meaning benefits for all these people. So as I was saying, ladies and gentlemen, these benefits that drive private companies to the provision of public utilities ensures that the people enjoy three benefits. First, increased efficiency. Second, better quality. And thirdly, better accessibility. So let's look at this systematically, thank you, madam, one by one. So let's look at increased efficiency. How exactly will privatizing ensure that the provision of public utilities will be more efficient? We say that government companies operate on bureaucracy. That if a company wants to do anything, like I stated earlier, they are subjected to multiple layers of authority and multiple layers and multiple volumes of paperwork. And they are also very fortunate to have governmental bailouts when they are in the red. Therefore, we say that these governmental companies, thank you, sir, can afford to be wasteful, can afford to employ extraneous staff, can afford, ladies and gentlemen, to have extraneous processes that make sure that these processes, this provision is inefficient. So when we privatize, we take away the bureaucracy, we take away the safety net of the governmental bailout, and we ensure that these companies are now driven by profit. Because, thank you, sir, because if they were to provide lousy utilities, ladies and gentlemen, the people can very easily transfer or move from one company to another, ladies and gentlemen. Therefore, this ensures and this compels all these private companies to streamline their processes, to fire extraneous staff, to ensure that their processes are as clean and as efficient as possible, making sure that the provision will be very, very efficient. An example of this would be in Britain, where pre-1979, where coal production was still public. We saw, ladies and gentlemen, constant cut-offs. We saw inefficient provision, and we saw these companies, thank you, sir, running into the red. Where the annual profits for these companies was negative £2.7 million. After privatization, we saw the provision being more efficient. We saw, ladies and gentlemen, these companies posting positive profits. On to the second point, the second example. Yes, sir.
Are you willing to actually account for the fact that the reason why they actually achieved a profit was because they were actually inflating the price of the provision to consumers?
No, sir. We say, in fact, if these companies would inflate profits, we say, firstly, the government check and balance will come into place. Secondly, that these people can very easily transfer from whichever company that is inflating prices to a company that is providing more reasonable prices, which is why we say the free market is more accountable. Second, on better quality. We say because of this profit motive, we therefore say that the only way these companies can differentiate themselves is to provide better quality services. And therefore this leads to increased quality. An example of this will be in Japan, where we saw before the privatization of the transportation system, crash rates were 33%. But after privatization, crash rates fell to 0.2% and waiting times decreased by 4 whole minutes. On the last point on better accessibility, we say that by breaking up these companies, we can see into smaller portions, we can see better accessibility, better coverage, because these companies want to provide a niche area of provision to many parts of the country. So for example, if I have one national or one grid, power grid, ladies and gentlemen, in New York, and if I live in New Jersey, I get my electricity from New York. But if I privatize my public utilities, these companies set up power grids in New Jersey, for example, and if I have any problems, it will be easier for me to approach these power grids, ladies and gentlemen. So having shown you that the privatization of these public utilities will lead to better efficiency, better accessibility, and better quality, ladies and gentlemen, this motion must stand.
Chairperson, ladies and gentlemen, quite frankly, we're very surprised at the model that the proposition team has offered you today. Because basically, what they're saying is that we should privatize companies, but privatize utilities, but give government control over what's happening in those companies, over the prices that those companies are setting, and allow the government to subsidize the amount of money that these companies can charge their consumers. Ladies and gentlemen, basically what they're saying is that privatization is bad. We recognize that, and the government should control it. And that's actually our case over here on this side of the debate. What we're saying is privatization is really bad for things like utilities because of the dangers that they do see for the consumers and for our government. And over here, to present a model that does do this, ladies and gentlemen, is an implicit concession that privatisation can be very harmful. So let's go through the model that the proposition team has offered you today. And what they're saying is that we're going to have a model where we have antitrust laws to stop monopolies from being created. We're going to have subsidisation for people who can't pay for the inflated prices that will occur under a privatised model. No thank you. And we're going to have government reviews. And this will only be in the developed world because quite frankly that's where we only have electricity. First of all, ladies and gentlemen, what we're saying is that antitrust laws, no thank you, will exist for a really good reason. Utilities are monopolies because of the nature of utilities. There's only one electricity grid. There's only one gas line in countries, and where there are more than one, ladies and gentlemen, they're owned by either A, the same people, or B, the people that are working with those people lacking cartels.
Exactly, madam.
No thank you. So you're conceding that monopolies are problems. So if they're going to be problems even under a government model, they're definitely going to be exacerbated problems under a privatized model where the government can't control anything. But let's move on to subsidization, because this is an implicit no thank you concession that the prices will be inflated, and they pointed to an example of this in Britain. Not such a problem in Britain, one of the most developed countries in the world, but a big problem in developing countries.
Madam.
No thank you. Where they do have electricity, where they do have water. Example, Bolivia, where they privatized where they privatised their water industry, ladies and gentlemen. And ultimately what we saw was an inflation of prices, which led to rioting, which led to the renationalisation of
Point of information, madam.
No, thank you, industry. Government reviews was also under their model. Ladies and gentlemen, we need the government to control what the private companies are doing. Yes, we do. So therefore, the government should just control it full stop. That's the safest way to ensure the dangers, no thank you, that are implicit under their model don't exist. So ultimately, what they're for is not for privatisation, but for government control of private companies, ladies and gentlemen.
On the point, madam.
No thank you. So let's move on to their second point. And this would private companies will provide better services because of the profit motive. Ladies and gentlemen, when private companies have a monopoly over an industry, because they will, even if they don't have a monopoly over the whole country, they did concede that they will have a monopoly over at least one industry, no thank you, in one particular area. And that means that the people living in that one industry sector, that particular industry, will be able to set the prices and the amount that they can consume. So that is a monopoly in that area, ladies and gentlemen. That's where we do get inflated prices. No thank you. And that's a problem for people who can't pay inflated prices for essential services. Water, gas, electricity, things that everyone needs. These shouldn't be determined in a free market, ladies and gentlemen. The government would have to limit the price, no thank you, because they conceded that those prices would go up. And we say that that's inherently unfair, very dangerous for people who can't pay, the most vulnerable in our society. No thank you, and that's why we should never privatise essential services. So moving on to our points today. And I will be talking about why utilities are not suited to private ownership, and also why the government has a responsibility to provide essential services. My second speaker, James, will be talking about the harms that are implicit in privatisation in terms of the vulnerable people that you'll be targeting, and in terms of foreign ownership, which will occur under their model. So, the nature of utilities is never in the public interest if they're privatised. Because as I've already said, the nature of utilities is that they are monopolies, ladies and gentlemen, if not only in one country, especially in one industry. You only have, and I'll take you in a second, one gas line, one water line, because quite frankly, it's very inefficient to have more than one if the infrastructure is already there. Yes, please.
It may surprise you to know that multiple companies are able to use things like the same electricity grid and the same telecommunication towers. That's why our first speaker was able to tell you about the multiplicity of telecommunication companies existing in the US.
Thank you. What you don't understand is that these companies are using the one grid, but only one company owns that grid, so they have to hire that grid for use.
Point of information,
No,
madam.
thank you. So when the one company owns that grid, when they're a private company, they don't have to listen to what the government says, but under their model they do anyway because it's going to be more expensive. When they don't have to listen to what the government says, they're going to set the price at anything they want. They're going to set the rent for the multiple users, the multiple providers of that grid at anything they like, which raises the prices of the electricity for everyone, including the companies that are renting that grid, ladies and gentlemen. So this is why this is an inherent problem with utilities. Because as we see in Russia, they only really have one provider of electricity, that's Gazprom. And that Gazprom provides electricity to everyone in Europe, basically. That's a monopoly, because the nature of monopolies, ladies and gentlemen, no thank you, is that you only have one. So privatization, you can't privatize to different companies, as I've already gone through, because either A, one person owns the grid, or B, one person rents the grid to multiple users, but that already inflates the price.
Point of information, madam.
No, thank you. So under monopolies or oligopolies, as they're pointing out, you have no competition and market forces fail because they won't be cheaper for consumers because they can set the price at anything they like. These are essential services. They should never be determined in a free
Point of
market.
information, madam.
And I've already pointed, no thank you, to the example of Bolivia, where they did privatize their water industry. We had rioting because the prices were that inflated that people on the ground couldn't pay for them. That's unfair and that should be stopped. So, my second point today is that the government has a responsibility to provide essential services. As they've already conceded, private companies exist for the profit, the bottom line. They're not subject to social conscience, ladies and gentlemen. There's no incentive to improve their services because they're a monopoly, because they're not accountable
Point of
to the
information,
people.
madam.
And I'll take you in a moment. The role of the government here is to step in and provide the best existing services that it can, and it can only do that if it's controlling the industry. Yes, please.
The government is fulfilling its duty by giving subsidies to those people who need subsidies. Answer this question. Why do you need to provide the same low price for every single person in society, poor or rich?
Answer this question. Why do you guys need to provide subsidies if it's going to be better for the consumers, ladies and gentlemen? We're saying the prices will be inflated. You're conceding that. Subsidizing is actually a reason for, it's actually an example of government regulation, ladies and gentlemen. That's conceding that you need government regulation. Privatization is bad for the consumer. You've already pointed that out. You've tried to solve that under your model, but you're not, because it's going to affect everyone in that society, ladies and gentlemen, which is why the government has a responsibility here. Because they're accountable to people through the vote, like no other company is. Because they see the big picture for our whole society. They see that efficiency is important, ladies and gentlemen. And therefore what you need is innovation. And it's the government who's going to say you need innovation for our society, for our long-term interests, which is what companies don't look at. So in conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, privatization is not good for anyone, and it's especially not good for our society, which is why the government has a responsibility to keep these utilities in control. Thank you.
The opposition wants to talk about questions. All right, let's talk about questions. Which private company in the world has absolutely no government regulations placed on it at all? No government audits, no health and safety? Really? Is this really the situation we see in the world today? Ladies and gentlemen, there's three things we need to look at, and the first one is the policy that we as the proposition came up and set out very clearly in our third speaker. And I have to admit, I'm a little disappointed because it seems like the opposition has tried to attack it by totally misrepresenting what we set out to say. They said that the checks and balances that we were talking about amounted to the government coming in and trying to regulate these private companies to an extent that it was basically public companies by any other name. But ladies and gentlemen, the things we're talking about, audit, antitrust laws, all private companies in all countries that have functioning free markets are subject to this type of checks. And if the opposition says that they don't like these type of checks, no thank you, sirs and ma'ams, they seem to be saying that maybe we should make all companies in the world public, which clearly isn't the status quo. Then on the second idea of the policy, they talked about subsidies. They said, ooh, subsidies, we're conceding this. But are we really? When we talk about subsidies, we said they're targeted subsidies, things like electricity vouchers, subsidies that are going to individual consumers, no thank you sir, and not the company as a whole. And this is absolutely in line with what we see in welfare systems existing in states around the world today. Because when we talk about subsidies, we are recognizing that there are actually people who are poor. People who cannot pay for things like electricity, even under a system of publicly owned companies. No, thank you, Madam Sirs. And that is why we need to step in to help provide vouchers to these people, for example, who won't be able to buy electricity almost no matter how cheap the price is. So when they try and come up here and talk about cartels, talk about a monopoly, we've already explained to you, antitrust means that isn't going to happen. But then on the second issue, the nature of these public utility companies. Now they say there's going to be a monopoly. They said there's one grid only. Now we already showed you in our point of information that this is in fact wrong. that even in the same geographic area, multiple companies can be using the same grid, and furthermore, under a system of privatization, no thank you sir, new players can enter the market, so this isn't going to be as much of a problem as the opposition wants to tell you that it's going to be. Now then they try to come back to this and say, except if one person owns the grid, then they'll make it really expensive. But we've already talked to you about how companies are motivated by profit, with profit motive. No, thank you, ma'am. And in fact, we tell you that it's not within a company's profit motive to try and price their grid, if they do in fact own the whole grid, out so expensive, because then simply put, no one is going to want to use their grid. They're driving all their consumers away. And that is why we continue to see affordably priced, I'll take you in a moment, sir, grid services in countries such as the US, where we talk to you about the communications network.
How
Yes,
can
sir.
people be driven away from services like electricity and water that they have no choice but to use from this provider who can price gouge?
I think you misunderstand my point, sir. My point was that the public utility providers have no incentive to price their grid rental services at such a high rate that no one else is going to want to use them because they'll have to pass such high prices, onto their consumers. As to your second point about price gouging, that brings me on to the third question today, the effects of what these public utilities companies do on society as a whole. Now you talk about price gouging, and that's actually very interesting. And it's very interesting because price gouging is actually illegal. Price gouging is illegal in situations where companies are privately owned, and that is why companies like Enron, who are private and tried to get away with price gouging, do in fact get taken down. That is the status quo. And if we want to talk about price inflation some more, we told you about multiple providers and how competition actually leads to decreased prices, which the opposition never dealt with. And furthermore, we always have, no thank you ma'am, our subsidies and social welfare programs for the poor. So before I go on to my own substantive, I'd like to point out that the proposition has not, the opposition has not dealt with our points that there's going to be an increase in quality and better accessibility. They've simply said, ooh, a monopoly, it won't happen. So let me go on to continue to prove our side of the house, that this is better for society and better for the government. And I'm going to be talking about 2 points. Firstly, the cost to the government, and secondly, the problems of political wrangling. So let's look at the cost to the government first. It should be pretty clear that public utilities represent a massive area of government investment. The costs are very high because of the huge numbers of people involved, the huge geographic areas that these utilities are providing over, and the very expensive processes that we're talking about, things like burning coal. This is made worse by the fact, as my first speaker already proved to you, that public utilities companies have every incentive, or have no incentive, to not do this in a very inefficient way. No, thank you, sir. So what we actually see, what the situation really is that we end up wasting massive amounts of taxpayer money, that's your money, ladies and gentlemen, with governments continuing to do something that they really aren't very good at. And that's frankly only going to result in higher taxes for all of us. A parallel example, no, thank you, ma'am, we see that in Britain, the inefficiencies in the National Health Services means that it costs more than 30% of the government's annual budget, and it makes a loss, in fact, an increasing loss every year. Under our model, we're freeing the government from this cost, and in fact, we now allow them to collect tax revenue on these companies because they're privately owned. This tax rate is usually about 20%. And this further offsets government costs, and more importantly, no, thank you, sir. It results in far more funds being available for the types of social welfare programs that we talked to you about. So we see in the US, who's moving away from a system of publicly owned electricity companies towards a system of privately owned ones. We see that this has helped them to deal with their growing public debt. And secondly, that there's now a welfare system where those who are living below the poverty line and receiving government welfare under this existing system, they're able to receive electricity vouchers, so their electricity is effectively free, whereas the funds did not exist to do this before companies were privatized. So because reducing the cost of the government is better for the government, and this in fact translates into benefits for society, especially those on the margin who most need these utilities, this motion must stand. And then the second, political wrangling. We see that when public utility companies are controlled by the government, they are able to become a tool of governance. And in fact, they can become, I'll take you in a moment, sir, hijacked by the political process. Yes, ma'am.
And the alternative is to allow the government no control and private companies to have all of it.
Ma'am, it seems you weren't listening. Private utility companies doesn't mean no control. It means that they're not run by the government bureaucrats, but the existing government legislation on the things that are common to all privately owned companies is still going to be in place. It's not the doomsday scenario that the opposition is trying to paint for you. We're not a team of extremes. So for what we see in their world, where it continues to be publicly owned, that political parties are able to falsely promise lower prices, even though it doesn't make sense. It would lead to their government being in the red, but it can be a clincher in national elections. Let's look at a parallel example. I'm not joking, ladies and gentlemen. It's called onion politics in India. In the state of Uttar Pradesh, the prices of onions are set by the national government, and it has frequently been the sole reason for government electoral victories when people start promising just how low they're going to make the prices of onions. And because we don't want to give the government this much power, and because we don't want to inflict these problems on consumers, just as you don't want the government to be pricing your onions, don't let them be pricing your power. Thank you.
Chairperson, ladies and gentlemen, the problem with publicly owned companies, according to the proposition, is that they are too bureaucratic and caught up in red tape. Yet, how is their proposal going to be more efficient when all they're doing is losing government control over essential services and still tying them up in the same regulations and red tape? And they made the point that no company in the world is without regulations. This is precisely the point, ladies and gentlemen, because they can't be trusted, because they don't have the public's interest at heart, and because they do things like set exorbitantly high prices, like target poor consumers, which they've implicitly acknowledged by having subsidies in their model, which I'll be getting to in a moment. So their proposal to be privatising these sort of companies is not in fact going to lead to a more inefficient allocation of resources. So I'd like to look at three ideas. Firstly, I'd like to analyse their proposal and what it's actually going to do in the real world. Secondly, I'd like to look at the costs to government of providing these public utilities. And thirdly, I'd like to touch on this idea of political wrangling. So on to this first idea of their proposal. So firstly, we've got this idea that there will be anti-monopoly laws and antitrust laws to stop monopolies developing. No, thank you. And what we've heard is that these laws will be effective because if you take an example of the United States, their electricity grid is split up into 4 areas and they're each owned by different companies. Well, firstly, if you live in the north, the south, the east or the west, you're still going to be having the monopoly of that one company, which is in fact supplying electricity to your house. So thank you. You can't choose which grid is going to supply electricity to your house, ladies and gentlemen. Secondly, if you're in fact going to be dividing the grid up, firstly, if you're talking about electricity, you can't actually tell where the electricity is in the grid or who put that electricity in, because there's no way of monitoring electrons within the electricity grid. So you can't, in fact, actually break up an individual grid into different parts. And even if you could, having multiple providers on the one grid would be inefficient. But thirdly, what we heard is that these grids, the one person who in fact owns this grid will in fact sell it out and rent it out to other providers of electricity because that would somehow be in their profit motive. But what's in their profit motive, ladies and gentlemen, is if they own the infrastructure, to make the price when they rent out this grid to other companies so high that those other companies can't compete with them in the market, ladies and gentlemen. No, thank you. That's in their market, that's in their interest, that's their profit motive, and that's what they're going to be doing. Then we had this idea that they're going to subsidise the poor. No, thank you. All these targeted subsidies to the poor are going to do is it's going to tell the electricity company, we're willing to subsidise the poor, let's say $40 a month. So they know that the poor person is starting at a base rate of paying for their electricity of 0. So then they're going to charge even more and just exploit the government subsidy to milk their own profit margins, ladies and gentlemen, because that's what these companies do. These companies are all about making profit. No, thank you. And so what they're in fact going to be doing is artificially raising the price when they know that there's a subsidy, because they know people are still going to have to buy it, and they're simply going to be able to milk this subsidy from the government and make more money. Then we have this, no thank you, arbitrary limiting of this debate to the developed world, which we think is rather surprising considering that if they're so concerned about public companies being inefficient at running resources, surely countries, no thank you, with smaller services and with inefficient governance are going to be even more inefficient, so we couldn't quite understand that. But then they also wanted to talk about the type of essential utilities in their model, such as sanitation. And quite frankly, ladies and gentlemen, if you want to improve the quality of sanitation in the developed world, it's already at 100%. So they want to put that as one of their burdens of proof. We don't understand why they've limited it to the developed world. But then they also wanted to talk about India. No, thank you. And we think India probably is a developing country if they're talking about only 43% of people having access to fresh water. Then we heard that they're going to be limiting the price. But if they're going to be limiting the price, ladies and gentlemen, what's the point of privatising it? You're implicitly admitting that these companies are in fact going to want to gouge their prices and in fact going to be exploiting and going to be exploiting these services. And if you limit the price then, ladies and gentlemen, how are these private companies going to be able to afford the better services that they're allegedly going to provide? No, thank you. They're not going to be able to have the money that they then need to in fact provide these mystical better services that they wanted. Thirdly and finally, no thank you, on their proposal, we heard that the quality of these services will improve. They talked about Japan Japan at the start and how there's a public railway crash in Japan which led to people dying? Well, firstly, what we'd say is that that's because the reason there is in fact less of an incentive for public safety guidelines to be enforced when there's in fact, no, because these things are expensive and there is no profit motive to have them. No, thank you. Firstly, and very quickly on the costs of government. The cost of government is to provide the services, and they said that this is going to be very expensive. But first of all, it's not a waste of money because it's an essential service that everyone needs. But also, if it's so expensive for the government to provide it, how come private companies aren't going to raise the prices to be able to afford to do it, ladies and gentlemen? No, thank you. Thirdly and finally, onto this idea that it's going to be subject to political wrangling, and that it's somehow a tool of governments. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, it is a tool of governments. We think it's great that the government's accountable over these services and in fact has elections over the provision of these services because there's accountability to the people, ladies and gentlemen. And we had this example of onions. Ladies and gentlemen, onions aren't a utility company. So moving on to my two key ideas today. Firstly, I'll be talking about how privatization hurts vulnerable consumers. And secondly, I'll be looking at how the proliferation of foreign ownership of essential services exacerbates the problems of privatization. And I'll take you in a moment. So this first idea about how privatization hurts vulnerable consumers. We've already heard that companies are about profit maximization, and this is going to make the price more expensive.
Like how the governments have a monopoly over the pricing of onions. When you have public companies, governments have a monopoly over the provision of public utilities, therefore they are not subject to the same incentive structures as profit-driven private companies.
But the point is that under both models, there's still going to be a monopoly. But the government, as you've already admitted, has this tool of governance, which is in fact going to allow them to be accountable to the people directly. When you privatize it, there is no accountability of these companies to the people. They can charge whatever they want because you have to buy your essential services, your water and your electricity from the one person. When the government's providing it, they at least have the incentive that they know that if they try and raise the prices artificially, they'll get voted out at the next election. There's the accountability, and that's why they need to be publicly owned. No, thank you. So this idea about how companies are about profit maximization. Well, they are, and this means that the prices are going to be more expensive for consumers. Because as we've already spoken about, these are natural monopolies. But furthermore, these companies don't care about the social outcomes of what they're doing. And we can see, no thank you, that small markets such as rural communities, where there are very high infrastructure costs to be able to provide services to these consumers, and yet very few consumers in those areas, there's going to be very little incentive for these companies to in fact be providing services to these people because the infrastructure costs are so high that they're simply going to cut these infrastructure services as opposed to pay the money, no thank you, to be in fact funding these services. So this is going to hurt people who live in isolated areas. Secondly, the prices are going to increase for poor consumers because they have to use them. And even if you have targeted subsidies, these electricity companies are still going to know that they can charge more because they'll factor in the cost of the subsidy into what they're charging these poor consumers. So what you're essentially doing, no thank you, how to all have experience in running these sort of services in other countries, so therefore they're more likely to win the tenders. And this is going to exacerbate the problems of privatization for several reasons. Firstly, because these companies are going to have foreign directors who don't really care about the local people anywhere near as much as local shareholders will. And this is going to exacerbate the problems of outsourcing and asset stripping like we see with private equity companies. And though this is going to make the services cheaper, they're simply going to use this as to increase their profits because there is in fact no incentive for them to make it cheaper there. So we've got a comparison, ladies and gentlemen. Either you can have foreign ownership where the services are going to get stripped and you're going to have no incentive for these people to keep providing the services. You're going to have domestic companies owning these services, which don't have the know-how to run these sort of companies properly and efficiently, because they've never done it before, unlike the state, unlike these foreign companies. Or thirdly, you're going to have the government, which is accountable to the people and has the experience of running it, ladies and gentlemen. The government is clearly the best option. So I've shown you how privatization hurts vulnerable consumers, and secondly, how foreign ownership exacerbates the problems of privatization. And so privatization is going to hurt consumers, ladies and gentlemen, and we're going to lose the accountability of these services, and that's why we mustn't privatize these services. Thank you.
Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. William Butler Yeats wrote this about the failure of centralization, about the failure of colonization. And that's exactly why we believe, members of the House, central control has failed. It is time to move on to private companies. And that's exactly why I've got three main points of contention in today's debate. First, on the issue of the policy that the proposition has given you. Second, on the issue of accessibility to those people who are poorer. And last, on the issue of politics. Let me go through them one by one. First, on the issue of the policy. They're telling us, members of the House, that we're still tying these companies in red tape. Is this really true? Definitely not. Let me draw you a very simple distinction today. There's a very big difference between having a government intimately involved in the running of a utility company and having a government oversight over the operations and the manifestations and the policies of a company. We go for the latter, Mr. House. We go for a situation,
information.
no thank you sir, where we police the manifestation and the actions of these companies to ensure that they're not price gouging, to ensure they're not going too far, so therefore there will not be too much red tape. Second, Mr. House, they accused us of only limiting this to the developed world. This is certainly untrue. My first speaker has given you a very simple and very clear policy, which said that we were going to limit this to countries with a functioning free market economic system. So therefore, this will also apply to the developing world. Secondly, Members of the House, we find it really strange that the policy hit is coming out so late, but even so, it is a hit that's really misplaced. No thank you, sir. Last, they tell us that we are limiting prices and therefore restricting the operations of these companies. That is flagrantly untrue. What we are not doing is that we are not setting a price range that the companies can settle in. But rather, Members of the House, we are preventing them from coming up with arbitrary price movements in a very short space and time. This is exactly what, no thank you madam, price gouging laws are about. It ensures that telecommunications companies cannot increase prices by 200% overnight. But it doesn't say in this house that they have to set a price within A to B, or in this case, from $1 to $50, for example. Furthermore, Mr. House, I must clarify the nature of our subsidy today. Our subsidy, no thank you sir, is consumer targeted, which means that, Mr. House, our subsidy never goes to companies. It goes to the individual consumers who need them the most. So companies will not be able to abuse this for their own, no thank you sir, selfish ends. Now, let me talk about the very important point about the lack of access for those people who are poorer. Now, the point of Mr. House is assertion riddle, because first, they tell us that we only have monopolies in today's society. Is this really true? We don't think so. Their logic for this was that we have, no thank you madam, separate grids in separate different areas. But we've really given you the point of contention that many different companies can use the same grid. Let me give you a very simple example. When Virgin Telecom first started, what they did was that they leased the grid from British Telecoms. So what happened was that both companies could still operate using the same grid system. And even if, Mr. House, we concede in the short run, there will only be one grid, no thank you sir, what happens in the long run is that when more companies enter the market, you can develop parallel grids, you can develop more systems of transferring public utilities from one person to another person, and many different companies can offer the same services.
Point of information.
Yes, madam.
Can you please tell me why, if one company owns the grid, where is the incentive not to jack up the prices for others?
First, you're clearly ignoring all the rebuttals I've just given you, but let me address your problem about only one company owning the grid. Now, Members of the House, just because one company owns the grid, does this mean they will not lease it out to other people? Clearly not. Why is this so? Because, Members of the House, if I have capacity that is not being used by me now, the most intelligent thing for any profit-motivated company to do is lease it out. Because then I get more profits. That is exactly why, Members of the House, British Telecommunications will lease it, no thank you sir, to Virgin Telecommunications. That is exactly why, Members of the House, we will have a proliferation of more companies providing the same services, driving down prices, and giving you more accessibility to those people who need it the most. Next, Members of the House, they've given us a second big assertion, that prices will rise indiscriminately. We certainly don't think so. And they've never dealt with Ao Yong's point about how increased competition means lower prices for everyone in society. Now, Members of the House, we also have many institutional check and balances against increases in prices. First, Dana has given you examples of how price gouging laws are still in place. And secondly, Members of the House, Ao Yong has also told you about how, no thank you sir, when you cut out the wasteful spending that public utility companies currently engage in, you also decrease the prices. But let me give you an additional tier of analysis. Members of the House, why will private companies give you lower prices? Because of one very simple reason, price discrimination. Just because the poor are poor doesn't mean that they're not a market. They're a market that still needs to be targeted. They're a market which still needs to be, Members of the House, focused upon. And that's exactly why private companies who are profit motivated will be intelligent enough to come up with different pricing plans for different types of people. Let me give you a parallel example. No thank you sir and madam. Sirs and sirs. Let me give you a very simple parallel example. When I go and watch a play in Singapore, for example, King Lear, which is coming to Singapore in July, what would I do? I see a pricing plan and I see that there's a price range for adults and a price range for students.
Point of information.
No, thank you, madam. The reason why they have different price ranges for different people with different abilities to pay is because they want to capture the whole market. They want to capture everyone who can possibly buy a ticket. And that's exactly why me, poor old me, can also watch King Lear, even though I'm not in Singapore now. No, thank you, sir. Let me give you a very simple example where this has taken place. In Indonesia, a study has reported that there was a 40% reduction in mobile phone pricing plans the moment privatization took place, when Startel and Telecom Indonesia started operating and competing with the government provider. And furthermore, members of the House, let me give you a further tier of analysis. That with our policies of a targeted subsidies, it ensures that all the government resources currently allocated towards the company in general can be focused, I'll take you in a moment, sir, towards one single target group which needs it the most. So therefore, we don't have wasteful subsidies, but we have targeted subsidies to those people who need it. Yes, sir?
If companies can price discriminate to poor people, why will they then not include factoring the cost of the subsidy into the price that they're charging the poor people and charge them even more?
You have fundamentally misunderstood the nature of our subsidy. The subsidy works like a voucher system. Like we give an additional amount to people who are poorer and people who cannot pay for the subsidies. This is how the government is doing it. The money does not go to companies at all. Now, on to the point about politics. They've told us that these people will be accountable to the public. We believe that public accountability is not enough. Why? First, the public only looks at superficialities. Let me give you a very simple example that Dana has brought up, the one about onion politics. The public only looks at prices, it doesn't look at efficiency, which is another great consideration when you're considering the success of a company, which is a point AUS has brought up. Second, members of the House, there is a lag time when you use public accountability systems. The ballot box is too slow, it comes once every 4 to 5 years, and in this time, members of the House, many business cycles would have passed, many billions of dollars would have been used. Wasted. And now, members of the House, let me deal with the very last point about how rural communities will not be able to get access to this. This is clearly not true. Because, members of the House, when I have a system of privatization, the profit motive drives these companies to establish niche markets in rural communities, and I widen the circle of accessibility. So therefore, members of the House, because I've proven to you on many different grounds, let me deal with the last point about foreign companies, I'm sorry. So members of the House, they've told us that foreign companies are a bad thing, but clearly we don't think so. Because if these foreign companies are going to provide you with greater accessibility and greater and better, cheaper prices, it is clearly better for everyone in society today. Now, members of the House, because I've proven you on the grounds of accessibility for the poor people and quality as well as efficiency of production, and I've also quoted very good poetry, please go with the proposition.
Chairperson, ladies and gentlemen, what we've really heard in today's debate was a very amorphous, transforming case from our opposition. We heard at first that we would simply have subsidies, and we heard at third that we would have targeted subsidies under a system of price discrimination. Basically, what our opposition said was the government would basically write a blank cheque for privatised companies. If it started to get a little bit too expensive for the poor people, that the government would have to implement a subsidy which would help them out with the price. So what we'll see under our opposition's model is privatised utilities, simply increasing prices to a level where the government is willing to systematically increase its subsidy. So what we basically have is no incentive for profit minimalisation or no incentive for better outcomes for consumers, but only a system where we allow privatised utilities to get away with jacking up the price and make the government foot the bill, ladies and gentlemen. In today's debate, that just isn't good enough. So I've got 3 major points of contention with our opposition's case. Firstly, whether or not privatisation actually provides beneficial outcomes for consumers. Secondly, whether or not the contingency plan, aka our opposition's model, actually concedes the problems with privatisation. And finally, what's the role of the government in today's debate? So looking firstly at whether or not privatisation actually provides beneficial outcomes for consumers. What we really heard were 3 central pillars of this idea from our opposition. Firstly, this idea of increased efficiency. Secondly, accessibility. And finally, quality of outcomes. So I'm going to be looking at all 3 systematically. Firstly, in terms of efficiency, what this was predicated on was the idea of competition. No, thank you. So opposition basically said that we have privatised utilities that like to compete with each other, but they themselves conceded that the nature of the utility is that it is most likely a natural monopoly. So there are basically 3 outcomes, no thank you, that we can get under our opposition's model. Firstly, what we get is we get a monopoly, which may be regulated by our opposition's system of antitrust laws, but we get a monopoly in any event. Now what that monopoly can do is it can set prices. No thank you. And you conceded yourself in the fact that they will set prices that may be a little bit too high for certain consumer groups, and so you've made the government foot the bill, which really proves the fact that these companies will be setting prices that are exorbitantly high and not acceptable in society. No thank you. So even if we don't get this natural monopoly that our opposition wanted to refute, what we get then are these regional monopolies that our opposition was talking about. So we have places like the United States where the power grid is divided up into, funnily enough, north, south, east and west, western power grids. So each of those individual power grids, whether or not the whole grid has been divided up, operates as a regional monopoly. So you have basically the same outcomes, no thank you, but on a smaller scale. Now, if our opposition wanted to have a far more utopian idea and divide it up a little bit more, what we then have is we have oligopolistic competition, where we basically get the same outcomes as a monopoly. You have small bodies which will obviously have to operate together to get the best prices, to set prices for consumers, and that's what we see time and again when governments actually privatise industry and privatise utilities. Yes, please.
Given that you conceded that we're having antitrust laws, how on earth are monopolies going to continue to operate?
All right, well, even if your antitrust laws, well, okay, firstly, the reason that you actually need antitrust laws, especially in the case of utilities, is because it's most likely that they will form monopolies. Even if they don't form the monopolies that antitrust laws are actually targeted at, what you do get are regional monopolies or oligopolies, which I just spent a fair amount of time actually explaining what the problems with those are. And whether or not you have a huge monopoly or lots of little monopolies or lots of little oligopolies, it's exactly the same outcome for consumers. No, thank you. Higher prices and worse outcomes in terms of efficiency. That's not good enough. That's why a government which actually has a responsibility to its people, an obligation to provide the best outcomes, is the best suited to actually provide essential services. We then heard this idea from our opposition that profit motives will encourage utilities to decrease price. Well, let's have a look at the idea of profit. What profit is basically trying to maximise the amount of money you get for a given service. So, yeah, the privatised companies will want to change the cost, but they won't want to put the cost down and actually benefit consumers, ladies and gentlemen. What they want to do is actually increase the amount of money that they get for each given service. That's not good for consumers, and that's exactly what our opposition's model makes happen. No, thank you. Now, moving on to this idea of accessibility for consumers. What we heard from our opposition was, firstly, it's better for everyone because there's less paperwork, but then they conceded that there's exactly the same amount of paperwork as there is under the status quo, perhaps even more with this lovely little idea of targeted subsidies. We then heard this idea, no thank you, that it provides better equity of outcomes for society. Well, if you're working on the basis of a profit motive, and you're a big conglomerate, or you're a monopoly, or an oligopoly, is there actually an incentive for you to invest in outreach communities like rural areas, where it's a very high initial startup cost, and it's a very long-term profit that you're actually looking at? No, there isn't, ladies and gentlemen. That's why privatised companies don't help with equity of provision. Yes, please.
You've not dealt with my analysis on how the provision of niche market actually incentivizes these companies to move into smaller rural communities and provide them with utilities.
Well, firstly, I just don't think that's the case. If you acknowledge yourselves that they operate purely on the profit motive, and it's just far more expensive and far more of a long-term return that you get from niche markets, there's fundamentally no incentive for these people actually to move and try and provide to rural areas. And even if they did, we think they'd factor in those costs into the provision of services for rural communities. That's bad for rural consumers and consumers in general. Now, moving on to this second point, which is no thank you, which is whether or not this contingency plan you've set up actually concedes the problems with privatisation. So basically the first pillar of the opposition's contingency plan was antitrust laws. I've already showed that this is actually much more important in the case of privatising utilities, because firstly they're things that everyone needs and obviously no one can go without, and that the establishment of monopolies is far more prevalent with utilities, and oligopolies operate in exactly the same way. We then had this idea of targeted subsidies. No thank you. Why do we actually need targeted subsidies so badly under a system of privatised utilities? Well, firstly, it's that outreach areas might not even get catered to, and even if they do, it's going to be far more expensive. But we also had this idea that people rent out their power grids. Renting out a power grid, whether or not that's highlighting a monopolistic form of competition, that is still factored into the price for consumers, and it doesn't happen under a government-operated system. That's better. That's worse for consumers, ladies and gentlemen. That only occurs under a system, no thank you, of privatised utilities. We then had this idea of governmental review. Well, governmental review is most certainly important and more important under a system of privatised utilities, because there's a far greater likelihood of monopolistic competition. There's a far greater likelihood under our opposition's model with targeted subsidies of jacking up the prices, and a far greater likelihood of consumers being done over in today's debate, ladies and gentlemen. That's just not good enough in today's debate. Now, finally, no thank you, onto this idea of the role of government. What we heard from our opposition was that governments use their public utilities as a political tool. And basically their major example was onions in India, ladies and gentlemen. Well, firstly, I'd like to think that most people can go without onions, and it's probably better if they actually do go without onions, ladies and gentlemen. But even if we're willing to work on this assumption that it's a political tool, firstly we'd say, no, it's not. We have to have an analysis of whether or not a government should be providing services and why, and an analysis of whether or not privatised industries can fulfil the same roles and obligations. Why a government is best equipped to actually provide an essential service is firstly because they're directly accountable to the public, no thank you, the entirety of society, not just shareholders. and so that ensures a greater quality of outcomes. Moreover, we think that governments have a greater incentive to provide services, to improve the quality of services in line with things like, for example, putting clean air scrubbers on coal power plants, those sorts of things, actually improving technology. When you have a system where it's privatised, ladies and gentlemen, there's absolutely no incentive for privatised companies to actually get with the times, ladies and gentlemen. Governments will always provide better quality services, better outcomes, and better equity for consumers, and that's why they are best equipped to provide essential services and not privatised companies. So, ladies and gentlemen, what have I talked to you about today? Well, firstly, I looked at whether or not we actually get the beneficial outcomes our opposition was talking about. Secondly, I had a bit of an analysis of their contingency plan, aka their model. And finally, what is the role of government in today's debate? Ladies and gentlemen, the fundamental question that we have to ask ourselves is whether or not a government which is obliged and can actually provide essential services can do a better job than a money-hungry, privatised company. At the end of today's debate, it's very clear that the only body in society that can provide essential services and equity of outcomes is the government.
Chairperson, ladies and gentlemen, in today's debate we had two teams who wanted to provide the best possible services for everybody in our community. On the proposition side, what we had was a model where private companies would determine their own prices, the way they provide their electricity, and who they provide it to, and that was going to be the most equitable way of providing essential services that everybody needs. What we said on the opposition is that governments exist to provide these services because of the nature of these services. Things like gas, electricity, and water were non-negotiable in any kind of society, and it was utterly unfair to determine the price of them in a free market. So let's ask ourselves the two questions that arise from today's debate. Firstly, would private companies be more accountable to our public under their model? And secondly, who would provide the best services? So, let's move on to the first point. Would private companies be more accountable than a government that is voted in by the public and could be voted out if they're not providing those services sufficiently? And what the proposition team argued from the beginning of the debate was that the government isn't the person for the job, because ultimately they're tied down by bureaucracy and they use essential services as a political tool to negotiate with their public, their main example being onions in India. Ladies and gentlemen, what you need to look at in accountability is the nature of private companies, and specifically the nature of private companies as utilities. Because as I pointed out from the beginning of my speech, and as my other two speakers pointed out throughout theirs, utilities are by nature monopolies or oligopolies because of the infrastructure that they provide. Ladies and gentlemen, in the US, regardless of whether or not it's not one power grid, a person living in the regional area of that monopoly of that company will always be subject to the monopoly's wishes on how much they wish to provide. And what the proposition team offered you was, yes, the prices may be inflated, yes, the company may have all the control, but the government will offer subsidies. And this was an implicit concession that it will be more expensive for the most vulnerable in our society, and that they won't be providing the necessary services, as my second speaker pointed out, for the most vulnerable in our society and for rural people who don't have the kind of location that permits them to have infrastructure there on demand. So in terms of this question, what we needed to tell ourselves was, first of all, these people were being unfairly treated, but secondly, these private companies won't be subject to much government regulation. And thirdly, these private companies could be foreign owned, which is even worse in this kind of situation where they don't have any kind of accountability. But let's move on to the second point. Would they provide the best services? And this was a very big clash in today's debate. What the proposition team argued was that because they're private companies, they're driven by profit. Yes, that's the problem, ladies and gentlemen, in today's debate. That's what we said. That's why you need the government to regulate these kind of things and to control them. Because if they're only driven by a profit margin, ladies and gentlemen, they're not going to worry about the poor in society. They're not going to worry about the vulnerable. And regardless of how streamlined you get, regardless of how many services they strip from what the public deserves to have, ultimately, the best services would always come from the government, because the government is accountable to the people through vote, and because the government exists specifically for having the kind of social policy that is long-term, ladies and gentlemen. Profit margins and profit incentives don't do that. In a social environment, ladies and gentlemen, it's the government that exists for the society's benefit. And ultimately, what that means is that long-term planning and long-term infrastructure would only exist under our model. So in conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, privatisation of utilities is unfair, but it's also very inefficient. Thank you.
So what are the two worlds that we see at the end of today's debate? Now, in the opposition's world, we see that governments have a monopoly over public utilities, that they can be corrupt, they can subject themselves to onion politics, that there are rare checks in the form of the ballot